Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the second of 5 webinars on Medicare drug payment and how it impacts pharmaceutical companies. My name is Pedro Salameo, founder and CEO of Definitive Health Partners. We focus on market access consulting.
And I'm John Warren. I'm the owner and principal consultant of Gettysburg Healthcare Consulting. We're a reimbursement consulting firm focusing on Medicare coverage, coding, and payment related issues.
John, welcome back. In the last conversation or the last webinar we had, we discussed how Medicare is siloed. It is, designed to have separate staff, very little overlap for the most part. So this week we're really going to focus on the 4 separate parts themselves. When we look at Part A, it was designed to protect hospitals against the cost from an inpatient perspective, hospital from a post-care perspective. Can you talk a little bit on how Part A is designed and what Medicare had in mind?
Yeah, so when Congress created Medicare initially, the whole idea was to be able to provide some level of financial protection to America's seniors from the cost of healthcare. For Part A, it was specifically for the cost of acute care hospital stay and post care after a hospital stay, either through a skilled nursing facility or through home health or even hospice care.
Okay. And John, the drug payment is included in the total cost of care. Why do we think that is part of the total cost of the hospital stay? Why was it designed that way?
Yeah, so when Congress first created what's called the inpatient prospective payment system, they created a system that was meant to provide a bundled payment that covered the hospital costs of care for treating a given patient based on their diagnosis. And as we know, drug costs are a substantial portion of hospital costs. So leaving those out of any kind of prospective payment or any kind of bundled payment system would have been a tremendous oversight on the part of the policymakers that came up with the system.
Yeah. No, fair point. I know we work with a number of companies that are in the acute care space. They definitely focus on the relationship of value equals quality divided by cost. So when companies are entering the inpatient setting, they really have to have their value proposition buttoned up. John, SNFs or skilled nursing facilities and hospice are also included in Part A, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Hospice and SNFs are Part A covered benefits, and they operate an awful lot like the traditional Part A acute care hospital payment in that it's a prospective payment. It's a bundled payment made to the facility that's intended to encompass all of the costs of care, either in the case of a skilled nursing on a per diem basis or for home health on a prospective payment basis. And that includes all of the services that are provided to the patient while they are under that state of care.
Okay. And you mentioned something about payments and outlier payments, and we're working with a few companies in terms of NTAP and some of the other outlier payments that are out there. In your experience, how realistic is it for manufacturers to go and get actually attain an outlier payment, at least for most products?
Yeah, NTAP payment is something that a lot of our clients think, oh, I've got a new product and I'll be able to get separately paid for it for a period of time when it's provided in the inpatient setting. And frankly, in my perspective, that's kind of a tough lift. There's 3 requirements that any new technology needs to meet in order to be eligible for NTAP payment under Part A. The technology has to be new. It's got to be something that isn't already currently on the market. It has to be a costly expense. It has to represent a significant cost to the hospital above and beyond what the hospital's normal costs for care would be. And then, in addition to that, the technology has to provide a substantial clinical improvement over the current standard of care. And Pedro, I think when you put those 3 things together, you get a pretty big hurdle to get over. And let me just give you an example. In last year's inpatient prospective payment rule, CMS said that they looked at a total of 43 different applications for NTAP. So 43 different manufacturers went to CMS, said, we've got this new product. We think we're eligible for NTAP and we think we should get separately paid. At the end of the day, after CMS did their review and their analysis, they only approved 17 of those. So that's only about a third of the total applications that were submitted. So you can see right there, and that's just one year, that's a pretty big hurdle for manufacturers to get over.
Yeah, and it's definitely a bit of an obstacle course to get approval. I mean, we've worked with a number of companies and it's gone well, fortunately. But yeah, it's not an easy process. Um, John, when we look at, properly enrolled patients, it seems that they can get coverage both on from Part A, but also Part B. Is that correct?
Yeah, there is a little bit of overlap between the Part A and Part B programs. They were designed to be two separate programs that had two separate goals and two separate foci. One obviously being acute care, inpatient facility kind of expenses under Part A, and then ambulatory or physician expenses under Part B. But things like home health care, it really can straddle that A B line depending on how frequently or how often the Medicare beneficiary is going to be under a home health plan of care. And things like the ESRD benefit, really do require enrollment in Part A and Part B to get the full benefit of the ESRD program. And then beyond that, there's a whole host of physician and other services that would typically be paid under Part B, but when they're provided to an inpatient, to a patient who is enrolled as an inpatient in a hospital, they're paid through Part A.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. So moving on to Part B, obviously this is where the therapies are administered via the healthcare provider. It can happen in the physician office. It can happen in the outpatient setting. Can you talk a little bit more about Part B and how it was designed?
Yeah, when the Part B program was first created, it was really intended to be what we typically think about as a medical insurance policy. It provides coverage for those ambulatory kinds of services that a patient receives outside of an acute care hospital setting. Office visits, for instance, x-rays, lab tests, even hospital outpatient care, and for what we're talking about today, a subset of physician administered drugs. Those drugs that you get in the office or in a hospital outpatient center that are either injected or infused. And to some degree, I should say, those drugs that are administered through a piece of covered DME are also payable under Part B.
Okay, so if I'm a manufacturer, what do I do then if I have a therapy that can be covered under both Part D and Part B? Can you
Yeah,
explain a little bit in terms of
yeah,
development strategies?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for the most part, Part B and Part D are fairly well firewalled off from one another. Part D was originally designed to be sort of a wraparound for Part B. As I mentioned, when the Part B benefit was created, it covers only a limited number of physician administered drugs. It's something like 600 different drugs, and these are all injected, infused drugs, certain oral anti-cancer drugs, and the like. So it's a very limited universe of drugs that are covered under Part B. And the Part D program, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, came in to sort of wrap around and provide that additional coverage for other prescriptions that Medicare beneficiaries may receive. Now, it gets a little sticky when you think about things like IVIG that
Mhm.
might be covered by Part B or Part D, depending on what the patient's individual diagnosis is,
Mhm.
and other services that, like vaccines, for instance, certain vaccines, influenza, pneumococcal, COVID, and hepatitis C are all covered under Part B, but other vaccines, like shingles, for instance, are a Part D benefit.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned that, I was thinking we do a ton of payer research, and it seems from the Medicare perspective, that's what we're seeing. But we're also seeing a lot of the plans trying to that are currently having therapies on the medical benefit side shift over to the pharmacy benefit side, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But most companies think that Part B is physician office only, but infusion centers are also in play. Can you talk about how important, how does site of care change the dynamics around Part B?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's something I think that our clients need to keep in mind because the site of care really affects the way that the drug is paid for by Medicare. For instance, the same drug could be administered in a physician's office or in a hospital outpatient clinic. In the physician's office, that provider is going to be paid on a fee-for-service basis. They administer the drug, they get paid the ASP, the average sales price, plus 6% for that drug. However, if that same drug is administered in a hospital outpatient center, then the drug may or may not be separately paid. If it's a lower cost drug, the cost of that drug may be bundled into that outpatient encounter. On the other hand, if it's a more expensive kind of therapy, the hospital outpatient clinic may be able to bill and receive separate payment for it. So it's really important to think about where the target audience is going to be.
Yep. No, that's a great point, John. Moving on to Part C, can you talk a little bit about Part C, obviously also known as Medicare Advantage? We've definitely seen a steady increase over the past 15 years, 10 to 15 years, but we also are seeing that or expect that trend to continue for the next 10 to 15 years, as some people are saying again that, or research is showing that it may get up to about 70% of the total Medicare, coverage when you compare it to fee for service. Can you talk a little bit about Med Advantage plans?
Yeah, so Part C, or what we now know as Med Advantage, are really kind of the agency's CMS's effort to manage spending on healthcare and to establish a more commercial-like insurance program where there's a more of an ability to manage the care that is being provided to patients, with the hope that costs would go down and quality would go up. Unfortunately, what we've seen is most Medicare Advantage plans actually cost a little bit more than typical fee-for-service plans do, but we're still seeing that growth in enrollment. And I think that's primarily due to two factors. Number one, the folks that are aging into Medicare at this point are more used to managed care. It's something that we've grown up with. It's something that we're more comfortable with than maybe our predecessors are. So there's a level of comfort there that maybe didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Mhm.
But beyond that, those Medicare Advantage plans can provide additional benefits. Sometimes there's zero copays, or zero premiums, or prescription drug plans in some cases, or even gym memberships. Things that to the folks that are aging into the program now want to take advantage of, and would otherwise have had to pay for out of pocket.
So you got me thinking of so many different questions, but so we're talking about the privatization of Medicare. Do plans need to follow certain Medicare guidelines? And if they do, to what extent?
Yeah, as a general rule, Medicare Advantage plans have to cover the same basic set of benefits that traditional Medicare does. So if traditional Medicare, for instance, covers an office visit, that office visit has to be covered under Medicare Advantage. Where Medicare Advantage can expand on that is their ability to provide those additional services that I talked about earlier that otherwise traditional Medicare wouldn't be able to provide.
Mhm. Okay. And in your opinion, you know, what should pharmaceutical companies focus on when educating for a launch, especially for a new product? Should they focus on educating Medicare plans, individual plans, or both?
Yeah, I think they really do have to think about both because, like we mentioned, Medicare Advantage plans have to cover the same set of benefits that traditional Medicare does. So any company that's launching a new product really has to give solid consideration to what is Medicare as a program going to do with respect to the coverage and the reimbursement of my new technology. But beyond that, if you're in an area that's got a high penetration of Medicare Advantage, or even a clinical space that is highly utilized or highly addressed by Medicare Advantage plans, you also have to consider how those plans are setting up their own coverage requirements. And that's even more important if you're dealing with something that may not be covered by traditional Medicare.
Okay. No, that's terrific insights. So moving on to Part D, and it's a relatively newer program. How does Medicare view the program? Do they think that it's been successful?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that they think the program has been fairly successful. Anything can be improved over time. But look, the way we talked about in the last webcast that we did, this discussion about a prescription drug benefit has been going on since the beginning of the Medicare program. And now we have a Part D plan, we have a Part D structure that very closely mirrors what a commercial payer's prescription drug benefit looks like. It operates very much the same way that a commercial plan does. It has formularies, there's the ability to use utilization management controls, and there's even sort of a bidding process or almost a capitated payment process that encourages these plans to operate in a way that they maximize their revenues within sort of the guidelines that CMS provides to them.
Sure. So John, one final question then. Do you think it's more important for manufacturers to have a strong value proposition or contracting strategy when they're approaching these payers?
That's a really good question, and it's going to depend on what the particular product that's being launched is. And let me explain what that means. So, one of the requirements that CMS has put on all Part D plans is that each plan has to provide coverage for at least two drugs in all classes, except for protected classes. So that means that a plan can provide two drugs, provide coverage for two drugs. There's no requirement for them to provide a third, a fourth, or even a fifth drug in that class, so long as they've provided two. Okay. So if I'm coming to market with a third in class, right, I really need to make the argument to that plan that not only is my third in class drug as good as what's on the market, but maybe even better than what's on the market. So I need to make that clinical argument. But then I also need to take the next step and explain to the Part D plan how my new product can benefit them and benefit their membership from an economics point of view.
Yep. No, great insight, John. Well, John, thanks again. It's always insightful talking to you. I feel like we could spend all day on these topics. I'd like to thank the viewers for coming and showing up for our latest webinar as well. As you can see on the screen, we have a few more coming up. Specifically, you can see we're talking about coverage and how to optimize that coverage and coding reimbursement strategy. But then the next one as well, which will be very insightful, is navigating through Medicare and really how to approach Medicare. We see this as a big gap in the marketplace, and just we've helped a number of companies just better approach Medicare. It seems right now it's a little bit more disjointed sometimes. But please like the video, and if you have any comments, share those as well. And we'll see you at the next webinar. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.